Ladies and gentlemen, seekers of truth and wisdom, let us embark on a journey into the unspoken realities of kindness, the hidden trials of the gentle-hearted, and the silent struggles of those who carry light in a world often drawn to the shadows. Today we unravel a paradox that many have witnessed, but few dare to question. Why do the kindest souls, the ones who love the deepest, who give without expecting, who see the world not as a battlefield but as a home, often find themselves standing alone? We live in a world that preaches goodness but seldom rewards it. We are taught to be kind, to be compassionate, to put others before ourselves. Yet the same world seems to cherish those who are ruthless, indifferent, and calculating. Those who take without giving, those who demand without gratitude, those who stand at the center while pushing the selfless ones to the margins. Why does this happen? Why do those who shine the brightest often feel the coldest solitude? Tonight we do not mourn this truth. We face it. We do not wallow in self-pity. We understand it. And in understanding, we find the power to shape our own path. Let us step forward with open hearts and fearless minds as we uncover the reasons behind this reality and, more importantly, what can be done about it. The selflessness paradox. Why giving without limits can lead to emotional isolation. There exists a fundamental contradiction in human nature that often goes unnoticed until it has deeply affected those who live by it. The paradox of selflessness is this: the more you give, the less people recognize your value. The more you sacrifice, the more you become invisible. Nice people, those who naturally extend kindness without expectations, find themselves caught in this paradox, trapped between their desire to help others and the unintended consequence of being left alone. At first glance, one might assume that generosity, warmth, and empathy would naturally attract companionship, that by being a source of comfort, understanding, and unconditional support, one would cultivate strong relationships filled with love and reciprocity. However, reality paints a different picture. The more selfless a person is, the more they fade into the background of others' lives. This is not because people actively wish to ignore or discard them, but because human nature often leads us to take consistent kindness for granted. When someone is always available, always understanding, and always willing to listen, their presence becomes an expectation rather than a gift. Their time is not valued as precious but assumed to be endlessly available. Unlike those who set boundaries, who demand respect, who make their needs known, the selfless individual often remains in a position where their worth is only realized in their absence. By then it is too late. There is another layer to this paradox, one that cuts even deeper. Selfless individuals do not just give their time and effort. They give their emotional energy. They absorb the pain of others. They provide strength where there is weakness. They offer reassurance where there is doubt. But in doing so, they leave little for themselves. Their emotional reservoirs are drained, not because they lack resilience, but because they have spent their energy ensuring everyone else is whole. A kind-hearted person will often listen to a friend in distress for hours, offering comfort, advice, and understanding. They will be the ones to check in, to remember important dates, to show up when no one else does. They do this not for recognition, but because it is in their nature. Yet, when the roles are reversed, when the kind person finds themselves in need of support, they are often met with silence. Not necessarily out of malice, but because they have unknowingly trained those around them to believe they do not need help, that they are the strong ones, the ones who will always be okay. Their struggles are overlooked because they have never made a habit of expressing them. This cycle deepens the isolation. The kind person begins to feel unseen, unappreciated, and worst of all, replaceable. They start to wonder why their efforts are not reciprocated, why their love does not secure them lasting companionship. The answer, though painful, is simple. People gravitate towards what they must earn. They respect what is scarce. They value what is not easily given. And the selfless person, by their very nature, gives freely. But this does not mean that kindness is a weakness, nor that selflessness is a flaw. The mistake lies not in being kind, but in failing to balance kindness with self-respect. There is a difference between giving and overgiving, between generosity and self-sacrifice. Kind people must recognize that their time, their emotional energy, and their presence are valuable. They must learn that it is okay to set boundaries, to say no, to prioritize their own well-being without guilt. The world does not need fewer kind people. It needs kind people who know their worth, who do not allow their selflessness to render them invisible. It is not about becoming selfish. It is about being wisely generous, about giving without depleting oneself, about loving without losing oneself, about standing strong in the face of a world that may not always appreciate what is freely given. This is the first truth in our journey tonight. The path of kindness should not lead to loneliness, but to a strength that demands recognition. And from this strength, a new kind of companionship can be found, one that does not take, but gives in return. The silent expectation, how society unknowingly takes advantage of kind souls. In the intricate dance of human relationships, there exists an unspoken rule, an expectation so deeply ingrained that it often goes unnoticed, yet it defines how kindness is perceived and ultimately how it is exploited. The reality is that nice people do not necessarily end up alone because they lack the ability to connect with others. Rather, they find themselves in solitude because society has conditioned people to expect kindness without acknowledging its cost. When a person is consistently kind, accommodating, and understanding, their behavior becomes a baseline expectation rather than a conscious act of generosity. If they are always the one who listens, who helps, who steps up when no one else does, it ceases to be appreciated, it simply becomes assumed. The weight of this expectation is not placed maliciously, nor is it always intentional, but it is real nonetheless. At the core of this silent expectation lies a phenomenon that is both psychological and social. People tend to notice when someone changes their behavior, not when they maintain it. A person who has always been independent, who rarely offers help, who maintains a degree of emotional distance, will be met with surprise and gratitude when they extend kindness. But a person who is always kind, always helpful, always emotionally available, their actions blend into the background. The absence of their kindness is felt more than its presence. This is where the cycle of silent expectation takes root. The kind person, wanting to be a source of support, continues to give. Others, consciously or not, come to rely on this. They assume that the kind person will always be there, will always understand, will always put others first. The weight of obligation shifts subtly but steadily, until the kind person is no longer seen as someone making a choice, but rather someone fulfilling a role. Over time, this unbalanced dynamic leads to exhaustion. The nice person, once eager to help, begins to feel drained. They notice that their kindness is no longer acknowledged, let alone reciprocated. If they choose to step back, even slightly, they are met with confusion or disappointment. What's wrong, people ask. You're not yourself. But that's the problem. They have always been themselves. It is just that their identity has been shaped by what others expect from them, rather than by who they truly are. This expectation extends beyond personal relationships. In workplaces, kind individuals are often given additional responsibilities because they are reliable and unlikely to say no. In social settings, they are the ones people turn to in times of need, yet they are rarely prioritized when they need support. Society as a whole rewards assertiveness more than kindness, often without realizing it. But the most painful realization for a kind person is this: when they finally step away, when they stop being the constant giver, many of those they supported disappear. Not out of cruelty, but because the relationship was built on an unspoken contract, one where kindness was expected rather than valued. This is why nice people often end up alone, not because they are undesirable, but because they have been conditioned to give without expecting, while others have been conditioned to take without reflecting. However, this does not mean that kindness is futile. It means that kindness, like anything valuable, must be protected. Nice people must learn that their time, their energy, and their compassion are not limitless resources to be given without discretion. They must understand that true connection comes not from being endlessly available, but from being intentional in where and how they give. To break free from this cycle, the kind-hearted must redefine their boundaries. They must recognize that it is not unkind to say no, that it is not selfish to prioritize themselves, that it is not wrong to expect reciprocity. True kindness is not about giving endlessly, it is about giving wisely. And when kindness is given with wisdom, it is no longer taken for granted, but truly valued. Strength in solitude. Why some nice people choose to be alone rather than be surrounded by insincerity. There comes a moment in the life of a kind-hearted person when they begin to see the patterns around them, the unbalanced relationships, the one-sided efforts, the quiet expectations that weigh on their shoulders. It is in this moment of realization that many make a decision, not out of bitterness, not out of weakness, but out of a need for self-preservation. They choose solitude, not because they do not crave companionship, but because they refuse to settle for connections built on convenience rather than sincerity. The world often misinterprets solitude. It sees it as loneliness, as a sign of social failure, as an indication that a person is unwanted. But for those who have given their kindness freely and received little in return, solitude is not a punishment. It is a sanctuary. It is a space where they are no longer drained by people who only take. It is a refuge where they are not expected to be endlessly understanding, endlessly patient, endlessly available. It is a place where they can exist without being reduced to a role. For some, solitude becomes the only option when they recognize that many of their relationships were built not on mutual care but on quiet dependence. They look around and see people who only reach out when they need something, who only acknowledge them when it benefits them. They remember the times they gave, they helped, they supported, only to be forgotten when they needed the same in return. And so, they make a choice. They walk away, not because they have given up on connection, but because they have learned that true companionship cannot be forced. There is a different kind of strength in solitude, a quiet resilience that comes from understanding one's worth. The kind-hearted who choose to be alone are not weak, they are strong enough to reject insincerity. They are strong enough to say, "I will not be part of something that does not value me." They do not fear loneliness because they have already experienced something far worse, the loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who do not truly see them. In solitude, they begin to heal. They rediscover themselves outside of the expectations placed upon them. They learn that their worth is not measured by how much they give to others, but by who they are at their core. They find peace in their own company, in their own thoughts, in their own pursuits. They start to prioritize their own happiness, their own dreams, their own needs, things they had so often set aside for the sake of others. And yet, despite the strength they find in solitude, the world will question them. "Why are you alone?" they will be asked. "You're such a good person. Surely people should want to be around you." But what the world does not understand is that nice people do not choose solitude because they are unwanted. They choose it because they refuse to be used, because they would rather walk alone in truth than be surrounded by people who only see them as a convenience. This choice is not always permanent. It is not a rejection of human connection but a refinement of it. Over time, the kind-hearted learn to be more discerning. They become more selective with their energy, more protective of their peace. They no longer give to everyone without question. They wait for those who prove themselves worthy, and when they do find those rare souls who truly value them, not for what they provide, but for who they are, they allow themselves to open up again. But until then, they remain in their solitude, not as a sign of defeat, but as a declaration of strength. They walk their path alone, not because they have no choice, but because they have made the choice. And in that choice, they find something far more valuable than shallow connections. To be kind is to carry a weight that is rarely acknowledged, let alone understood. Nice people are often expected to be the emotional backbone of every relationship they enter, the steady force that others lean on in times of distress. They listen, they comfort, they give. And for a time it feels good, it feels purposeful. But what happens when the weight becomes too heavy? What happens when the giver has nothing left to give? The world tends to overlook the emotional exhaustion that comes with being the person others rely on. When someone is consistently kind, their support is taken as a given. Their patience is assumed. Their ability to handle things, to make others feel better, to step in when needed. It all becomes an expectation rather than an act of generosity. And in this quiet, unspoken contract, the kind-hearted bear an unseen burden, the responsibility of holding everything together, even when they themselves are falling apart. There is an inherent imbalance in relationships where one person is always the giver. It starts subtly, an extra favor here, a bit of emotional support there, but over time it becomes a pattern. The nice person becomes the default problem solver, the one who makes sacrifices, the one who says yes when others hesitate. And because they rarely complain, because they rarely ask for anything in return, people assume they don't need anything. The reality, however, is that even the kindest souls have limits. Emotional exhaustion doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly, like a candle burning down to the wick. The giver begins to feel drained, yet they continue to give, hoping that their kindness will eventually be reciprocated. They tell themselves that people care, that their efforts are noticed. But then comes the moment of realization, a crisis of their own, a time when they need someone to be there for them, and suddenly, there is silence. The very people they supported, the ones who relied on their kindness, are nowhere to be found. This moment is heartbreaking, not because the giver expected something in return, but because they finally see the truth. Their kindness was never truly appreciated. It was convenient, it was useful, but it was not valued in the way they had hoped. And so, the exhaustion deepens. Not just physical, but emotional. They feel invisible, not because they were never seen, but because they were only seen when needed. This is why nice people often retreat. They withdraw not because they no longer care, but because they are too drained to keep pouring into others without being replenished. They start to set boundaries, to say no, to prioritize their own well-being, and when they do, they are often met with confusion. You've changed, people say. You're not as kind as you used to be. But what they fail to realize is that the kindness is still there. It has just been redirected, no longer given to those who take without giving back. The exhaustion of always being the giver is not just about relationships. It affects every aspect of life. It seeps into work, where kind employees are given more tasks because they won't complain. It affects families, where one person becomes the default emotional caretaker. It even extends to strangers, where the kind-hearted are expected to always be patient, always be understanding, always be the ones who accommodate. But true kindness should not come at the cost of self-destruction. The nice people of the world must recognize that their energy is not infinite, that their well-being matters just as much as anyone else's. They must learn that setting boundaries does not make them selfish, it makes them human. And perhaps, most importantly, they must understand that their kindness loses its meaning if it is given to those who do not appreciate it. So they begin to step back, to reclaim the parts of themselves that were lost in the endless giving. And though it is difficult, though it feels unnatural at first, they realize something profound. Kindness is most powerful when it is given wisely, not freely. And in that wisdom they find a new kind of strength, not in giving endlessly, but in knowing when to stop. The paradox of kindness, why being too available makes people undervalued. In a world that praises kindness, it is ironic that those who embody it most often find themselves overlooked. There exists a strange paradox. When someone is always there, always willing, always understanding, their presence becomes an afterthought rather than a privilege. The more available they are, the less they are valued. The more they give, the less they are noticed. And in the quiet spaces between their sacrifices, they begin to ask themselves, why does kindness seem to push people away rather than bring them closer? The truth is that human nature is wired to appreciate what is scarce. When something is rare, it is seen as valuable. When it is abundant, it is taken for granted. This principle applies not just to material things, but to people as well. A person who is difficult to reach, who sets firm boundaries, who gives sparingly, is perceived as valuable. Their time and energy are seen as something to be earned. But the kind-hearted, who are always available, always ready to help, often find themselves devalued, not because they lack worth, but because their presence is too easy to access. People do not do this intentionally. It is not that they actively decide to overlook kindness. It is simply that they stop noticing it. They assume that the kind person will always be there, that they will always understand, that they will never demand more than they are given. And because there is no urgency, no risk of losing them, there is no effort made to appreciate them. It is only when they finally walk away that their absence is felt. But by then, it is often too late. This paradox plays out in friendships, in relationships, in workplaces. The employee who never complains and takes on extra work is often passed over for promotions because their efforts are expected rather than celebrated. The friend who is always available becomes the one who is invited last because people assume they will always say yes. The partner who is endlessly understanding finds themselves neglected, their needs pushed aside, because they never demand attention. What makes this realization so painful is that kindness is not meant to be a strategy. The nice person does not give because they expect something in return, they give because it is who they are. But over time, they begin to notice the imbalance. They see how others are treated when they make themselves less available, when they assert their needs, when they are selective with their kindness. They begin to understand that people respect what they have to earn. And so, the kind-hearted face a difficult choice. Do they continue as they are, giving freely and hoping to be valued, or do they change, not by becoming less kind, but by becoming more mindful of where and how they give? The ones who learn the lesson choose the latter. They start setting boundaries. They become more selective with their time. They understand that their energy is precious, that their presence should not be assumed. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable. It feels selfish. But then something remarkable happens. People start to notice. When kindness is no longer endless, when availability is no longer guaranteed, those around them begin to appreciate it more. They begin to value what was once overlooked. The kind person, for the first time, sees that their worth was never in question. It was simply hidden beneath their constant availability. The paradox of kindness is not a curse, but a lesson. It teaches that kindness is not about giving endlessly, but about giving meaningfully. It reminds the kind-hearted that their value does not decrease because others fail to see it. It is only when they learn to step back, to prioritize themselves, to recognize their own worth, that the world begins to do the same. The silent rebellion, why stepping away is an act of self-respect, not bitterness. There comes a moment in every kind-hearted person's life when they realize they have given too much, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet accumulation of small sacrifices, unnoticed efforts, and unreciprocated kindness. They begin to feel the weight of their own generosity, not because they regret it, but because they see how little it has been valued. And in that realization, a shift occurs, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of a newfound respect for themselves. Stepping away is not an act of weakness. It is not a sign of bitterness. It is, in many ways, a silent rebellion against a world that has mistaken their kindness for obligation. They do not make a scene, they do not demand recognition, they simply remove themselves from the spaces where they are taken for granted. They stop answering calls that only come when someone needs a favor. They stop making time for people who never make time for them. They stop giving endlessly to those who only take. At first, this withdrawal is met with confusion. What happened, people ask? Why are you acting differently? But the truth is, they are not acting differently. They are simply no longer willing to play a role that was never meant to be theirs alone. They have spent years being understanding, being patient, being the one who always adjusts. Now, they have chosen themselves. This choice is not about cutting people off or shutting the world out. It is about redefining what it means to be kind. Because real kindness is not about self-sacrifice. It is about balance. It is about recognizing that giving should not come at the expense of one's own well-being. It is about understanding that those who truly care will respect the boundaries that are set, rather than be offended by them. And yet,